sits at the table. His hands are steady, but something in his chest starts to stir, a cold knot tightening behind his ribs. He opens the envelope. The letter is short, the kind of short that says more than long words ever could. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. You don't know me, but you should have. You taught me the world doesn't forgive the weak. Address: 314 Ashburn Lane, Blue House. You'll know what to do. There's no name at the bottom, just a single letter, M. Hank reads it again, once, twice, a third time. His eyes don't blink. The words don't change. That address, Ashburn Lane, he knows it. It's out near the edge of town, a place with more boarded windows than open ones. Nobody lives there, not anymore. He hasn't thought about it in years. The letter shouldn't mean anything. It could be a prank, a mistake, a cry for help meant for someone else. But Hank knows better. Something about the words, about the tone, the anger, pulls at a corner of his memory. He folds the letter gently, like it might break, places it next to Margaret's photo. She's still smiling. But now, that smile feels different, distant, sad. He stares at the photo for a moment longer. Then, for the first time in a long time, Hank Miller stands up with purpose. There's a house at the end of a quiet street. Old, forgotten, the kind of place where time doesn't move, where dust gathers on memories and the air smells like wood and silence. Inside, sitting by the window, is a man. His name is Frank Miller, though people used to call him Hank. Once he wore a badge, a detective with a sharp mind, a steady hand, and eyes that could see through lies. Now he's retired, alone, just a shadow moving through a house full of ghosts. He wakes up early every morning, not because he wants to, but because he always has. Muscle memory, pain memory. Habit is hard to kill, harder than love. The house creaks when he walks. The floorboards groan like they're tired of holding on. He makes coffee, black and bitter, like always. Slices 2 pieces of toast, but eats only one. The other sits on the counter, untouched, every day, just like she used to do. Her name was Margaret, his wife. She's been gone for 6 years. Cancer. Now, her smile only lives in a photograph above the fireplace. He talks to that picture sometimes. Not much, just a word here and there, as if hoping she might answer back. Their son, Tommy, left not long after the funeral, moved to the city. The calls grew further apart, until they stopped altogether. Hank never asked why. He just understood. The living room is full of little things that mean nothing to anyone else. An old recliner, a rusted fan, a faded American flag in a glass box, and a drawer he hasn't opened in years, the one that still holds his service pistol. He spends most of his days sitting at the window, watching nothing happen. Same street, same silence. Until today. Hank steps outside, the cold biting through his shirt like tiny teeth. He walks to the mailbox, like always, but there's no newspaper. Only one envelope. Plain, off-white, thick paper. No stamp, No return address. Just his full name, written in careful, old-fashioned cursive. To Mr. Frank H. Miller. He pauses. It feels personal. Like whoever wrote this knew more than just his name. He looks up and down the street. Nobody. No cars. Not even a dog barking. Just cold air and the rustle of dead leaves. He goes back inside, closes the door.
Frank Miller's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, the worn leather cool beneath his fingers. The letter burned in his pocket like a secret he couldn't shake. The quiet of his small town seemed thicker today, as if the shadows themselves were watching him. He hadn't planned to go out this morning. No, today was supposed to be like any other. But the words on that paper pulled him forward, demanding answers he wasn't sure he wanted. As he drove down the familiar roads toward Ashburn Lane, memories flickered in his mind. That street was like a ghost town now, houses boarded up, yards overgrown, and silence reigning where laughter once lived. He remembered his days as a detective, walking those very sidewalks, chasing leads, and trying to bring justice to a place that didn't always want it. Pulling his car to a stop in front of the blue house the letter had named, he stepped out into the cold air. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and a gentle wind rustled the dead leaves scattered across the cracked pavement. The house loomed before him, its paint chipped and faded, windows dark and lifeless. The front gate creaked eerily as he pushed it open, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. Hank approached cautiously, every step stirring old memories and an unease that settled deep in his bones. He reached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved through the dim rooms, the only light coming from narrow cracks where curtains had fallen. Furniture lay scattered, coated in years of neglect, and the faint smell of mildew hung heavy. He found the living room first. A toppled chair, a broken lamp, and on the wall, a faded photograph barely visible through grime. Something about the scene felt frozen in time, like the house was waiting for someone or something. In the kitchen, he noticed a worn table with a single cup still sitting on it, stained and cracked. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, leaving behind pieces of a life abruptly abandoned. Hank's eyes caught a scrap of paper pinned beneath the cup, illegible writing smudged by time. Moving through the house, he felt the weight of silence pressing down. No signs of life, but the place was too undisturbed, too quiet to be truly empty. His detective instincts screamed that this house held secrets, waiting to be uncovered. Just then, a faint sound drew his attention, a soft creak from upstairs. He hesitated, the old fear and caution rising up. But something stronger pushed him forward. Step by step, he climbed the narrow staircase, each creak echoing through the empty halls. At the top, he found a bedroom door slightly open. Inside, moonlight spilled through a cracked window, illuminating a small desk cluttered with old papers and photographs. One photo caught his eye,
a picture of a young man with determined eyes, standing proudly in a police uniform. Hank's breath caught. The face stirred a memory deep inside, a name on the tip of his tongue. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind him. The house seemed to exhale, as if alive and watching. Alone in the darkness, Hank realized this visit was only the beginning. Questions would follow, and answers might be darker than he ever imagined. Frank Miller's mind was a storm as he left the abandoned house behind, the image of the torn photograph burning behind his eyes. The letter, the empty room, the eerie silence, they all gnawed at him, tugging at threads of memory long buried beneath layers of guilt and regret. He drove slowly through the rain-slick streets, each drop blurring the city's harsh lines into smeared shadows, as if the world itself was trying to hide its secrets. That night, Frank sat in his dimly lit living room, the only light coming from a flickering candle. The silence around him was thick, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number of the local police station. Years had passed since he'd last worked with the force, but the voice on the other end was familiar, steady, a reminder of a life he once led. He explained the situation cautiously, careful not to reveal too much, yet desperate for answers. The name in the letter, the strange address, the eerie scene he had encountered, all of it raised more questions than answers. The officer on the line promised to check the records and get back to him. Frank felt a flicker of hope, but also a rising tide of dread. Something about this case was different, personal. Over the next few days, Frank's routine fractured. He pored over old case files, revisiting memories he had long tried to forget. Faces blurred and names faded, but one detail stood out: a suicide case from years ago, dismissed hastily at the time, that bore chilling similarities to the letter's tone and handwriting. The realization was like a cold wave crashing over him. Late one evening, as rain battered his window, a shadow moved outside his house. Frank's heart leapt, but when he looked, there was no one there, just the empty street, slick and shimmering under the streetlights. The paranoia crept in like poison, whispering that he was being watched, followed. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind became a sign, a warning. His phone rang suddenly, the shrill sound slicing through the quiet. A voice, distorted and cold, whispered on the other end, "You didn't save her, but you still can try." The words sent a shiver down Frank's spine. It was a challenge, a taunt from the shadows of his past. He clenched the phone tightly, the grip of old regrets tightening around his chest. Determined to uncover the truth, Frank returned to the police station the next day. He faced skeptical eyes and bureaucratic walls, but his persistence paid off when he uncovered a name, one that wasn't in any official record, but appeared in an old, forgotten file. The name linked the letter, the abandoned house, and a tragedy that had once shattered a family. As night fell, Frank found himself driving again toward the edges of the city, to a place where memories lingered like ghosts. The rain had stopped, but the streets remained slick, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. He parked near a quiet park, its emptiness echoing the void he felt inside. Walking slowly, he came upon a bench under a leafless tree. There, a small, weathered envelope was taped to the backrest. Inside, another letter, this one more urgent, more desperate. It spoke of secrets hidden deep, of a reckoning long overdue. The words struck Frank like a blow, dragging him deeper into a labyrinth of sorrow and suspicion. The night pressed in, thick and suffocating. Frank sat on the bench, the cold seeping into his bones, but he refused to leave. The past was calling, and he was determined to answer, no matter the cost. Frank Miller's footsteps echoed softly against the cracked pavement as he approached the ramshackle house once again. The night was colder than before, a biting chill that seeped into his bones and sharpened every sense. The fog curled around the street lamps like ghostly fingers, casting long shadows that danced and twisted with the wind. This house, silent, abandoned, but heavy with secrets, had become an obsession, a puzzle he was determined to solve. As he reached the porch, the old wooden boards groaned under his weight. The front door stood slightly ajar, swinging with a slow, eerie rhythm that suggested someone, or something, had recently passed through. A sense of unease twisted in his gut, a mixture of curiosity and dread. He pushed the door open carefully, stepping inside the darkened house where dust motes floated like tiny specters in the feeble moonlight filtering through cracked windows. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of decay and forgotten memories. The walls were stained with time and neglect, wallpaper peeling like dead skin. Frank's eyes slowly adjusted to the dimness, revealing scattered remnants. A broken chair tipped over, a shattered picture frame, and a floor littered with dried leaves and debris. Every detail whispered of a sudden departure, an interrupted life left hanging in the balance. He moved deeper into the house, each step stirring the silence into a low, oppressive hum. Then something caught his eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper lying near the base of the staircase. Kneeling, he picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a torn fragment of a photograph, edges frayed and colors faded to grayscale. The image showed a young woman, her smile faint but haunting, eyes filled with a quiet sorrow that mirrored the atmosphere surrounding him. Frank's heart tightened. He couldn't place her face immediately, but the unease grew heavier. Was she connected to the letter, to the mysterious suicide note he'd received? The questions piled up, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, more threatening. He stood up slowly, his mind racing, and made his way to the room at the back of the house, the one where the chair had been overturned. There, a single chair faced a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The mirror's glass was smeared and cracked, reflecting a fractured image of the room and himself. On the ceiling, a single nail protruded, its threadbare string dangling loosely. The chilling thought crossed his mind. Was this the place the note referred to? Had someone stood here, on the edge of despair? Frank's fingers brushed against a small, dusty notebook lying forgotten on the floor.
Opening it, he found pages filled with hurried, shaky handwriting. The words were fragmented, filled with despair, confessions, and pleas for forgiveness. It was a diary, a record of someone's final days, their inner torment spilling out in ink. The entries mentioned names, places, moments of cruelty and kindness, but also a deep, unrelenting sadness. His breath hitched as the realization dawned. This diary belonged to the woman in the photograph, and she was the missing piece to a story that was far more tangled and tragic than he had imagined. The weight of her sorrow, her final cries trapped in those pages, pressed down on him like a physical burden. As Frank left the house that night, the diary clutched tightly in his coat. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the streetlights whole. He felt watched, not just by unseen eyes, but by the heavy presence of unanswered questions. The mystery was no longer just about a letter. It was about a life undone, a silent scream from the shadows begging for justice. The envelope sat on Frank Miller's kitchen table, cold and heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He stared at it, the handwriting eerily familiar, delicate, precise, almost like a ghost's whisper from the past. Inside, the letter was folded with care, each crease worn from unseen hands, carrying a message that pulled him deeper into the shadows of his memories. This was no ordinary note. It was an echo of something he thought he had left behind. The words inside the letter were sparse but devastating. A farewell written in trembling ink, a silent scream of despair sealed in a fragile confession. The letter's author spoke of a life unraveling, of pain too deep to bear, and a darkness that had settled like a permanent cloud. Yet what unsettled Frank the most was the signature, a name he recognized from the past, a name he had buried beneath layers of guilt and regret. It was the same name that haunted the corners of his mind on sleepless nights. Frank's hands trembled as he reread the letter, each word stabbing at his conscience. The room around him seemed to shrink, the familiar walls closing in as the gravity of the message sunk in. This letter was not just a cry for help. It was a summons, a challenge thrown at him from the depths of forgotten mistakes. The silence of his house was deafening, broken only by the distant ticking of an old clock marking time that no longer seemed to matter. Determined to find answers, Frank resolved to trace the origins of the letter. His first stop was the local post office, a place where memories of his past life flickered like dying embers. He approached the clerk with careful questions, hoping to uncover a clue, a scrap of information that could lead him to the sender. But the clerk's eyes were cautious, and the files seemed locked tight, hiding secrets behind bureaucratic walls. Next, Frank visited the neighborhood, walking the streets with a new sense of purpose. The houses stood silent, their windows dark, as if the very air held its breath. He asked quietly about the name, about the person who might have written the letter, but the answers were vague, whispers lost in the wind. Neighbors avoided his gaze, their faces guarded, as if afraid to reopen wounds long healed or ignored.
As days passed, the weight of the letter pressed on Frank like a shadow he could not shake. The line between past and present blurred, memories flooding back unbidden, moments of laughter, Cries and silence that had once defined a life intertwined with the one now reaching out to him. Each recollection was a thread pulling him closer to a truth he feared to face. One night, as the rain fell in relentless sheets, Frank sat by his window, the letter open before him. Outside, the world was a blurred smear of black and white, the streetlights casting ghostly halos in the mist. His thoughts churned in a storm of doubt and despair. Was this letter a genuine plea, or a cruel trap set by memories that refused to rest? The question haunted him, a persistent whisper in the cold night air. Suddenly, his phone vibrated sharply on the table. The screen was blank. No caller ID, no message, only the silent hum of uncertainty. Frank's heart pounded as he answered, the line crackling with static. Then a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably real, whispered, "You can't run from this, Frank. The past never forgets." The call ended abruptly, leaving him alone with the silence, the letter, and the weight of unresolved pain. In that moment, Frank realized the journey ahead would not be easy. The letter was more than a message. It was a key to unlocking a past that had long been buried, but never truly gone. The answers he sought lay tangled in shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And he was the only one who could face the darkness and find the truth. Frank Miller couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but in its place came silence, thicker than the night itself. A silence that pressed against the windows, crept beneath the doors, and settled into the bones of the house like smoke after a fire. He sat in his recliner, the letter still within reach, as if letting it out of sight might let it disappear. But it didn't. It never did. He didn't know what he was looking for anymore. Closure? Redemption? Or perhaps just proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The voice on the phone had stirred something in him, something old, something fragile. And the moment that voice echoed in his ear, he stopped being a man reacting to a mystery and became a man being hunted by one. He went to the garage that morning. Dust had settled over everything like time frozen in place. He opened a rusted toolbox, dug under old parts and scraps of his past life. There, beneath a faded police badge and a cracked photo of his late wife, he found it. A case file. One he had promised himself he'd never open again. A suicide. A teenage boy. No weapon. Just a body and a note that never made sense. And a father, grief-stricken, angry, who blamed Frank for closing the case too soon. Frank sat on the cold floor of the garage, the file open in front of him. Newspaper clippings, photos, scribbled notes in his own handwriting. It was all there. The name on the original letter. Not exactly the same, but close. Close enough to make his stomach twist. The boy's name had been Caleb Rhodes. His father, Richard Rhodes. Frank remembered him, sharp-eyed, always pacing, always accusing. "You missed something," the man had screamed at him once. "You're not looking hard enough." Frank had ignored him. The evidence said suicide. It was neat, clean, wrapped up and filed away. Now, nearly 20 years later, that file was open again, and nothing felt clean anymore. Frank drove out of town that afternoon. Not to escape. He had long accepted that some ghosts follow you, but to find something real. He needed to see the place again. the house where it happened. It sat just beyond the edge of the woods, abandoned now. A sagging porch, windows like blind eyes, paint peeling like old scars. He stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with dust and rot. But beneath the decay, the silence was different. It was listening. Every step echoed, floorboards groaned. And then he saw it, taped to the wall, almost hidden behind the shadow of an old coat rack. Another letter, new, crisp, written in the same delicate hand. This one wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply said, "You buried the truth. Now you'll dig it up." There was no signature, no date, just a sentence, quiet and merciless. Frank folded the letter and put it in his coat. The pieces were lining up. Someone was bringing the past back, piece by piece, and they wanted him to feel it. As he turned to leave, he paused at the staircase. Something caught his eye. Scratches along the banister, deep, violent, like fingernails dragged in panic. He ran his hand over them. The wood was splintered, real, not memory, not hallucination. He didn't remember those being in the original report. On the drive home, the weight of it all pressed down. He wasn't just retracing steps, he was being led. And whoever was behind it knew exactly how to break him. Frank didn't go home that night. He drove without destination, the road unfolding under his headlights like a forgotten map. Town after town blurred past his windows. Gas stations closed, diners dark, empty fields bathed in the colorless tone of moonlight. But none of it mattered, not anymore, because something had shifted, not just in the case, but inside him. The weight of the second letter still pressed against his chest pocket. He kept touching it as if to make sure it hadn't vanished. The phrase kept echoing in his mind. "You buried the truth. Now you'll dig it up." It wasn't a threat. It was a command, and Frank couldn't ignore it. He ended up at an old motel on the outskirts of a forgotten county, the kind of place where rooms smelled like mildew and the only sound was the buzz of a dying neon sign. The clerk barely looked up. No name was given. Cash was enough. Inside the room, Frank sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The silence pressed against his ears like static. His thoughts drifted, not to the case, not to Caleb or his father, but to a memory he thought long gone. A boy. Not Caleb, someone else, younger. A moment, just a flash from years ago. A voice screaming, sirens, his hands trembling, and then gone, like a door slammed shut in his mind. He didn't understand it, but it made his chest tighten, like grief he didn't know he had. He reached into his coat, pulling out the old case file again. The picture of Caleb was on top, a boy in black and white, 15 maybe. Quiet smile, eyes that didn't quite look at the camera. The police report had called it suicide. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, but something had always felt wrong. Frank had felt it back then, that itch at the back of his neck, the sense that there was more. But he ignored it. There was pressure from above. Closure was needed, and so he closed it. Now, Someone had opened it again.
In the drawer of the motel nightstand, he found a phone book, dusty, pages yellowed. He flipped through until he found it. Rhodes, Richard, a number, a rural address, still listed, still there. Frank didn't hesitate. The next morning, the sun was pale and cold. A thin fog clung to the trees as he drove into the hills. The road twisted, narrow and cracked. Houses thinned, then vanished. Only trees now, and silence. Finally, he saw it. A mailbox, rusted and leaning, the name barely legible. Rhodes. The house was small, forgotten by time. The paint peeled, the porch sagged, curtains drawn like eyes that didn't want to see. He knocked. No answer. Again. Nothing. But as he turned to leave, he heard it. A creak. The door, slowly opening. No one stood there. Just a long, dark hallway and the scent of dust and rot. Frank stepped inside. The house was dead quiet. Furniture covered in sheets. Pictures turned to face the wall. He called out, "Richard?" But the silence swallowed his voice. In the living room, he found something strange. A table, empty, except for one thing, a third letter, folded, clean, placed perfectly in the center. He didn't want to open it, but he did. He was never alone. You just didn't look hard enough. No signature, just that. Then footsteps, upstairs, slow, deliberate. Frank froze. He called out again. Silence. Then a door closed, somewhere above. He climbed the stairs. Each one creaked like it remembered something terrible. At the top, a hallway. Doors all shut, except one. Light flickered from inside, like a candle, or something worse. He stepped in. The room was empty. No furniture, no man, just a wall covered in photographs. Of him, Frank, from years ago. Different cases, different towns. Him in uniform. Him leaving courtrooms. Even a picture of him at his wife's funeral. All pinned, all watched. He staggered back. On the floor, a small recorder. Pressed play. A boy's voice. "Why didn't you stop him, Mr. Miller? He hurt people, and you let him." Then static. And Frank realized this wasn't about Caleb. This was about something else. Something buried even deeper. Frank descended the old staircase, the wood groaning under his weight like it remembered every step he'd taken before. The air inside the house had grown colder since he listened to the tape. He could still hear the boy's voice whispering inside his mind, "Why didn't you stop it?" Not a question, an accusation wrapped in innocence, cutting deeper than any bullet he'd ever faced. Outside, the world felt unreal. Gray skies draped over the horizon like a blanket soaked in sorrow. The street was empty, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Frank stood by his car for a moment before getting in. He didn't turn the engine right away. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, staring back at the house that had just punched a hole through time. He didn't need coffee anymore. Adrenaline did the job. Inside his glove compartment was a folder, dusty, yellowed, filled with documents he had never really let go of. The case, the boy, Caleb Rhodes. Every name,
every note, every photo. Back then, it was labeled suicide, open and shut. But now everything stunk of something worse, something buried. One name came back again and again in those papers. Harold Crane, a guidance counselor, middle-aged, helpful, present at every meeting, always close to the students, but never officially questioned. Frank remembered him, vaguely, like a bad aftertaste he couldn't place at the time. He made a call. "Hey, it's Frank Miller. Yeah, I know I'm not on duty. I need a favor. Can you run Harold Crane through the database? See where he is now?" A pause. Then the voice on the other end said flatly, "Crane's dead, 2 years ago. Car crash. Didn't survive the impact." Frank closed his eyes. That weight on his chest, that dull pressure was back. Not relief, not closure, just more questions. Back at the motel, he couldn't sleep. He tried. God knows he tried. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wall in that abandoned house, the one covered in photos, strings, notes, years of obsession. Someone had been watching this for a long time, maybe even watching him. At 3:17 a.m., something slid under his motel door, a soft sound, just paper scraping against old tile. Frank rose, cautious as always. No one in the hallway. Just a folded paper on the ground. No envelope. He opened it. "The dead speak better than the living, Frank. Go listen." And beneath that, an address, handwritten. Oric Cemetery. Frank knew the name. Isolated, forgotten, near the schools where the old case had played out. He hadn't set foot there in over a decade. That morning, gray and heavy, Frank drove there. The cemetery was barely maintained, grass overgrown, names on the stones barely legible. But one grave stood out, clean, recent flowers, someone still cared. Caleb Rhodes. He stood in front of it. No words, no prayers, just silence. Then his eyes fell to the inscription beneath the name. Never heard, never saved. Something moved near his foot. He looked down. A small cassette tape, wrapped in plastic, just sitting there, as if waiting. He didn't pick it up immediately. He just stared at it, because somehow he already knew this wasn't the end. This was only the middle. And whatever came next would hurt more than everything that had come before. Frank sat in his car with the cassette still in his hand, the plastic wrap cold and slightly wet from the morning dew. He hadn't moved in minutes. The weight of that small object seemed far greater than it should have been, like it carried years of buried pain inside its magnetic tape. Eventually, he slipped it into the old player he'd reinstalled in the car, part nostalgia, part necessity for moments like this. A click, a faint hum, then the sound of a breath, shaky and slow, followed by a voice he hadn't heard in 23 years. It was Caleb. "Mr. Miller, if you're hearing this, I guess you're finally listening now. I always hoped you would. I left you the signs, the file, the photos. You probably thought it was over after they buried me, but I never really left." The voice cracked, not from age, it had been a boy's voice when recorded, but from sorrow stitched into every word. They said I jumped from the 4th floor, that I left no note, that I was just broken, but that's not the whole truth. Frank clenched his jaw, eyes locked forward, the cemetery still in his peripheral vision. Caleb's voice continued, steadier now. There was a man. You know his name. You saw his smile in every hallway. You shook his hand. You trusted him. And I did too, at first. Static fuzzed, then steadied. I wasn't the only one. I wasn't the only one. There were others. I saw it. I heard it. I tried to speak, but no one believed me. I tried you. Remember the file I gave your desk? The drawings? You told me to go home and get rest. Frank felt something shift in his chest, like a rib breaking from the inside. You thought I was just another tired kid. You didn't see what I saw, and that cost me everything. The tape clicked softly, another segment spooling. I waited for justice, Mr. Miller. I waited for someone to open the door and say, we were wrong, we failed you. But no one did. So I started leaving things behind. I needed you to walk the same path I did. I needed you to see it all through my eyes. Not out of revenge, but so maybe this time someone would understand. Frank leaned forward, resting his forehead on the wheel. Rain started tapping the windshield like fingers drumming nervously. You can still stop it. There's one left, one still walking free. Not Crane, another. He wore a badge once, like you, but his wasn't tarnished by time. His was rotting from the start. There was a long pause, then one last whisper. Find him, Frank, and listen to the silence between his words. The tape ended. Frank sat back slowly, the sound of the rain growing louder. His breath fogged the window, and through it the cemetery blurred into a dream. He didn't cry. Not exactly, but something inside him loosened, like a knot he hadn't known was there. That night he drove to the station. He didn't go in, just parked across the street and stared at the building where he used to believe in the truth. Somewhere inside, he knew, was the man Caleb was talking about. He just didn't know which face it wore yet.
Frank Miller didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen until dawn, wrapped in silence and memories. The cassette had stopped spinning, but the words still played in his head on a loop. Caleb's voice, so calm, so steady, held more weight than a courtroom confession, and more pain than anything Frank had ever filed into a report. At 6:12 a.m., he lit a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the burden of knowing. For hours, he stared at the same photograph on the fridge door, a group shot, years ago. Him, his wife, his old partner, and one other man. In the back, slightly off-center, wearing the same grin in every memory. Officer Marvin Teller. Marvin had retired early, moved out of state. At least, that's what the paperwork said. But something about the way Caleb said he wore a badge once burned like acid in Frank's gut. If Teller was the man Caleb meant, then he'd been walking around untouched, unspoken, and unpunished for over 2 decades. Frank opened his desk drawer
and found the old address book, covered in dust, names crossed out in fading ink. He flipped until he found the page, Teller, M, and a P.O. box. Not a home address, a trail gone cold. But Caleb had left more than just a name. "Listen to the silence between his words," the boy had whispered. And Frank knew what that meant now. Teller had always been careful, never direct. He'd let others speak for him, let victims stay confused, let guilt rot in shadows where truth never reached. Frank drove across town in silence. The streets were empty, as if the city itself didn't want to witness what came next. He stopped at a payphone. Yes, a payphone. He still knew which ones worked. He called an old contact from his early years, Doris, once a clerk, now mostly alone and forgotten by everyone but ghosts. She owed him a favor, and she remembered Marvin. She always remembered the ones who smiled too much. Last I heard, he bought property upstate, middle of nowhere, cabin, land, no neighbors, no questions, she said. "You lookin' to visit, Frank?" He didn't answer. Inside, it smelled of old wood and medicine. And there he was, Marvin Teller, seated by the fireplace, reading a book with one hand and holding a glass of something brown with the other. He looked up, smiled, the same smile. "Frank Miller," he said, calm as Sunday morning. "Now there's a face I haven't seen since the world made more sense." Frank didn't speak, just looked. Looked long enough to see the tremor in Marvin's right hand, the one holding the glass. "Thought you might come," Marvin added, placing the drink down carefully. "Eventually." Frank closed the door behind him, and silence filled the room like fog. There were no accusations, no shouting, just the soft crackle of firewood and two men watching each other from opposite sides of decades. "You came all this way for what?" Marvin asked, voice low. "Justice? Revenge? Closure?" Frank's reply came slow, cold. "No, I came to listen to the silence." For the first time, Marvin's smile faded.